I hope everybody is doing well, as I always do, and I hope that our study in Isaiah is continuing to be of benefit to you. We're going to slow down the pace a little bit for this lesson. Normally, our goal is to cover a few chapters at a time, but chapter 6 is such an important chapter in the book of Isaiah that we want to slow down for just a moment this week, and in this lesson, we'll only look at what we see in chapter 6. Chapter 6, of course, is the great picture of the vision of God that Isaiah has. And out of this vision comes Isaiah's call or commission to become a prophet, with a very famous statement about how that ministry will go and the results of it. Before we talk about what the chapter is saying, though, and the picture that it is presenting, we might stop to ask, why is this vision of God and this story of how Isaiah became a prophet here rather than in some other place? We would expect this to be perhaps in chapter 1. For example, if you look at the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah's book begins with the story of how it is that he became a prophet. Similarly, in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel's book starts with a vision of God. But Isaiah doesn't start that way. As we have seen, the first 5 chapters of the book of Isaiah is a kind of a general sample of the indictment and the charges that God has against Israel. And that is followed then by this vision of God and this commissioning of the prophet. So why is it backwards? Why does it come here rather than up front? Well, I don't know if there is a definitive answer to that particular question, but it does certainly seem to fill a dramatic kind of role. That we've heard the indictments, we've heard the charges of the first 5 chapters. God complaining about his people and their behaviors and their attitudes. And then after that is all delivered, we get a picture of the God who has made these charges. Maybe there is something to that. Maybe it is that God wanted these people to have this record first of what the problem was. And if they didn't take those charges very seriously, then perhaps they would be moved to take them seriously if they then understood the nature of the God who is making those charges. We're going to see here in chapter 6 that there was always a resistance to the prophetic message, especially to that of Isaiah. And so maybe this vision of God comes after the initial statement of God's charges to sort of uh, underline the seriousness of them, to show them that this is not just Isaiah complaining. This is not just some trivial complaint, but it comes from the kind of God that is described in chapter 6. So maybe that is part of the explanation. But also, we should understand that the vision of God here is not just a vision of God on his throne. It's not just a vision of God and what heaven looks like, as if that were to somehow satisfy our curiosity about that. No, this particular judgment or this particular vision of God emphasizes judgment. If we want to get a little bit more detailed about that, sometimes when God appears in the Bible, he comes to call somebody. And so, for example, in Exodus chapter 3, God appears in the burning bush to Moses to call him into service. But sometimes a prophet will see one of these visions of God because God is angry, because God is about to unleash judgment. And what we have here in Isaiah 6 is kind of a combination of those two things. That this vision of God is to call Isaiah to speak a message of judgment. And it is that judgment on Israel, the coming wrath of God for their sins, that was emphasized so heavily in chapters 1 through 5. So, in a sense, chapter 6 just simply continues and culminates the judgment theme that we've already seen in the book. But as some scholars have also suggested, the placement of Isaiah 6 in this particular spot in the book also creates kind of a hinge to the story that we're going to read starting in chapter 7. One of the things we're going to hear in Isaiah chapter 6 is that Isaiah will be sent to preach to a people who will not listen. And we're going to get a spectacular confirmation of that as we start in chapter 7. And so this vision, this call, serves also as kind of a preface to some of the things that are going to come in a little bit. I don't know if any of that really completely answers the question of why this vision does not come up front in the book of Isaiah. But hopefully, we can begin to see that there may be some good reasons for the way it is put together. Well, in the vision here in chapter 6, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord, Isaiah says. And so the prosperous temporary reign of King Uzziah is now coming to a close. And you may remember, as we noted in our introductory classes, that Assyria is on the rise. As Israel's kingdom is getting weaker in this time of prosperity and peace and all the good things going on is winding down, the kingdom of an enemy is on the horizon. Tiglath-Pileser III is making Assyria strong again. And so this is this kind of moment of crisis in Israel's history. And it is at this moment when the human leadership of Israel is fading and the leadership of an oppressive foreign people is growing that we have this vision. Isaiah says, I saw Israel's true king. The true king of Israel was not Uzziah. It's not going to be any other human king, including Hezekiah, who's going to play a prominent role in the book and will turn out to be a man of great faith. But ultimately, we're going to see that there is no human on earth who is the true king of Israel, that the real king of Israel is God. And the fate of the nation does not lie in the hands of a human king, but in the hands of God. Isaiah says, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. Of course, a throne is a symbol of kingly power. And this was much more prominent, of course, in the ancient world than it is in our world today. In our country, we don't have a king. Many nations of the earth today do not have kings. We've gone to more democratic forms of government. But even if you want to think about England, where they still have a king, if, only in a very limited sense, the throne in the palace is a very special place because it is a place that represents the power of the king or of the queen. And certainly 2,000 years ago or 2,700 years ago, as it is in the case of Isaiah, when all the ancient peoples lived in kingdoms, basically, this idea would have been very, very understandable to them. That the king has a throne. That throne represents the seat of power, as it were. However, a throne is not just a place where kingly power is symbolized. It is also the place where judgment comes from. Because one of the things that the king of any ancient kingdom did is that he gave judgments for people. If there were disputes, if there were cases that could not be decided in any other way, then they would come to the king. You remember we hear this about Solomon, that people would come to the king and ask for judgments in their cases. And so the throne is also the place from which judgments are rendered. And that's a very important part of this picture here, because it's not just the picture that God has power, it is the picture of God as judge that ultimately develops here. We are told that God is lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. And again, this is something that we can only picture in our imaginations. But in the time of Isaiah, this picture, this idea would have been much more immediate. It would have been something that they were perhaps much more familiar with by seeing it with their own eyes. There's really nothing in ancient art that completely corresponds to what Isaiah is talking about here. But here are some pictures of Assyrian kings on their throne. And you'll notice what is here, that the throne, the feet and everything, especially the feet of the king, are not on the level of the ground. You see the ground under the throne. The king has a footstool. Here you see the great king, and everybody else is depicted as kind of in a smaller type, as it were, that they are always lesser. That's another way to present it. Here you see also the king in this image right here to the bottom right, above everybody else. And you'll know that, notice that unlike these scenes here, I think this one may actually be a Persian one, but here in this Assyrian picture, the king is actually above everybody else. And so that is the picture that Isaiah is drawing on here, that the king sits above others. Here is another ancient Near Eastern scene. I think this is from the handle of a ceremonial dagger, and this is a drawing of what the original looks like. But you can see the prince here seated on his throne, and he is clearly above everybody else. And so that's the idea, except Isaiah has it magnified even greater, that God is sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted. The picture is that he is high above everything else. He's even above the earth itself. You'll notice what we're told here, that the train of God's robe fills the temple. Now, of course, in the ancient world in which Isaiah lived, temples and palaces are very closely related. The palace is the home of a king, the temple is the home of a god, and sometimes they are closely combined and related. That's the picture that Isaiah is drawing on here, that the temple, of course, is God's palace. It is God's throne room. Next to the temple in Jerusalem was Solomon's palace with his throne room, but above that on the hill was God's palace, and which was God's throne room. You recall that in the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant is sometimes described as God's footstool. So as you see in the picture here, the king with his feet on the footstool, and the king is high above that. That's the picture that we're working on here, that the temple is not the place where God is. And there, I think, is this theme in the Bible to resist the idea that God is somehow contained in the temple. He is always depicted as far, far greater than anything that the temple could hold. And so here is God. He is sitting on his throne, but this throne is not in the temple. The throne is above it. And if anything, God's feet may touch the earth at his footstool. And the temple is not filled with the presence of God, the temple is filled with the train of his robe. And so the fringe, the edge of God's robe, the part that would be behind him or below him as he sits, that's what fills the temple. But God himself is far above it because God is far greater than anything on this earth, and he is not contained by it. So we get a sense from these ancient pictures of the idea, but you have to kind of magnify it to get the picture that Isaiah is painting here. Now, there's something else in the scene that you see here, that the king is sitting on his throne, and on the right, and presumably on the left of the other side of the picture, there is this winged creature here. And this would be a cherub. And so the idea is that this is a supernatural being here, this cherub. You see that he has a human face and the body of a lion and wings like an eagle. He's this kind of composite being. It's not the kind of being that you would find anywhere on the earth, but it is a greater order of being, and that the king sits where they are, that he is enthroned among these greater creatures. Well, that is the picture again that Isaiah is painting here, that you have God exalted and seated on his throne that is above the earth, and there up in that heavenly space are seraphim. So to continue on with the picture here, who are these seraphim? Well, interestingly, they are fairly mysterious creatures in the Bible. They are not mentioned that much. And also, interestingly, this is the same word in Hebrew, unless I've made a mistake here, but it is the same word as what is translated fiery serpent. And so the fiery serpents in Numbers chapter 21, same word here, the seraphim. So what are seraphim, and why are they called fiery serpents? Well, the answers to that may not be, completely known to us, but there seems to be this evidence, this sense that they are spiritual beings who have serpentine-like bodies, and like a serpent is long and narrow, that they are like a lightning strike, that they are often the personification of lightning. And here we see also that they have wings and that they have hands in the vision as well. They always appear in the Bible, the few times that they do appear, in context of punishment. Whenever we hear about one of these, it's never a good thing. And so whenever you read in the Bible about a seraph appearing in the scene, it means that God is about to unleash some horrible kind of punishment. So again, we have this scene in which it's not just God and his glory, not just God being exalted, but it is also this picture of judgment, and the seraphim are part of that picture. Again, this is some visual imagery that is perhaps not so clear to us, but would have been much clearer to the people in Isaiah's day. You see this winged bull here, again, human face, the body of a bull, and wings like an eagle. This particular statue was part of the entrance to the throne room of one of the kings of Assyria. So as you head toward the presence of the king, you are in the presence of these otherworldly beings. Here you see in a carved panel another one of these beings, and you see he has the head of an eagle and the feet of a man, and he has two sets of wings, an upper set and a lower set. Here is another one. And so you see this particular creature has, again, two sets of wings, an upper set and a lower set. And here's perhaps an even clearer image. The seraphs here in Isaiah chapter 6 have 3 pairs of wings. And so you think about the rise of the Assyrian Empire in the background of Isaiah's message and all of this Assyrian imagery. It is but a pale imitation of the real thing that Isaiah sees. These seraphs with 6 wings, 3 pairs of wings. And we are told that with 2, the seraph covers his face, that he cannot look at the presence of God. With 2, he covers his feet. Feet normally in the Bible are the part of any being, man or animal, that are constantly in contact with the ground, and so they are usually the dirtiest part of any person. And so he covers this part as well. And with 2, he flies. So he flies around God in heaven. He's in the heavenly presence, and yet he dares not look at God himself. Um, we're told here that they cry out one to another, "Holy, holy, holy is the God of hosts." Get my text to behave here. So, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Holy, holy, holy is a phrase describing God that is never used anywhere else in the Old Testament. It's a unique kind of phrase, and scholars have suggested that it's kind of a superlative, that you say this word over and over to emphasize it. Of course, the great thing about God that is being described here and emphasized by these seraphs is his holiness. Perhaps we ought to just take a moment and remind ourselves what holiness is. Very often we think about holiness as a kind of separation, that what is holy is separated, that it belongs to God and it cannot be used for anything else. That is certainly part of the idea of holiness. I'm not convinced, though, that that is the essence of the idea of holiness, because that definition certainly doesn't work when we apply it to God, to say that God is somehow just separated. No, the idea of holiness is more like a complete and utter purity. That whatever God is, he is completely pure in all ways, in, in all ways that are significant. He is pure morally. He is full of righteousness, as it were. That everything about him is true and proper and appropriate and correct to the ultimate degree, that there is nothing amiss with God, that he is completely perfect in all of his ways. And it is this God that we have to deal with. And God will not be in the presence of that which is imperfect. He will not tolerate that which is defiled, that which has been corrupted. Certainly he cannot be in the presence of that which is sinful, and that which is sinful cannot be in the presence of God himself. There is this sense, therefore, that develops in the Bible that God's holiness is therefore a destructive thing, that nothing impure can be in the presence of something and someone who is so pure. And that certainly is the idea that is brought to the fore here in Isaiah chapter 6, that God in his complete and blazing holiness stands as a threat to everything that is around him. There's also a sense, and this appears primarily in texts like the book of Leviticus, where holiness and life are related, that life depends upon holiness. And to enter into God's holiness, to become holy like God is holy, not in perhaps the same degree or in every way, obviously, but to begin to share in God's holiness is the key to life. And here we begin to see a glimpse of why this vision is going to be so important in the book of Isaiah. Because Israel's survival, Israel's life, depends on her holiness. And what we have seen in chapters 1 through 5 is a picture of everything that is exactly the opposite. That Israel has become unholy, and so her holy God will not be able to stand her presence. We heard that as early as chapter 1, where God said, "Get out of my temple. Quit bringing these sacrifices in here because you have corrupted. Your hands are full of bloodshed." These unholy people cannot be with a holy God, and their existence is threatened because of their unholiness. But moving on here, um, God's slides are not advancing correctly. Um, the seraph call out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." Whenever we hear this phrase in the Old Testament, um, God of hosts. The hosts represent a great multitude of beings. That's what a host is, a multitude of beings. And so the picture is that God is the heavenly king, and around him are this great multitude of heavenly beings. Some of them are angels, some of them are cherubs, some of them are the seraphs. In Revelation chapter 4, we get another picture of some other beings that are up there in the presence of God. And they constitute God's royal court, the attendants and the servants of God who wait upon him up in heaven. In other texts, God's hosts are his armies, that God has this great force that he can unleash against other people or nations. And I'm not sure that those are necessarily distinct things, that God has a court and an army. It may be that his court and his army are the same thing. But we're still in this picture of this royal depiction of God, but a royal depiction of God that emphasizes judgment. It's kind of a rule of thumb that whenever God is called Lord of hosts in the Bible, that some destructive power is about to be unleashed, that this is a threat, that you don't meet the Lord of hosts innocently, that when you hear about God being the Lord of hosts, somebody is in serious trouble somewhere. The seraphs call out and say that the earth is full of his glory. God's glory is something akin to God's majesty, the emanation, the radiance of his power. And the picture is that God's glory and majesty is not limited to Judah or to some place that is local, but God is the universal king. That the eminence of his glory fills the entire earth. And we're told that as all of this is going on, that all of the earth is shaking with the words, and the temple is filling with smoke. Sometimes the temple fills with smoke because of sacrifices or the incense, but that's not the smoke that is mentioned here. This is a kind of smoke that is mentioned in other depictions of God. For example, in Exodus 19 and 20, when God comes down on Mount Sinai, that smoke accompanies God's presence. And this kind of smoke is a smoke that is associated with a destructive kind of thing, the smoke that is associated with a burning fire. And it is another part of this picture here in Isaiah 6 of impending judgment. And so, really, everything about this scene, we have God sitting on the throne. We have these seraphim who are always in scenes of judgment. And we have the holiness of God, which is a destructive thing against all that is not holy. And then we have this smoke. I mean, every detail, as it were, of this picture adds up to a picture of impending judgment. So this is what Isaiah sees. And in verse 5, Isaiah gives us his reaction. He says, "Woe is me, because I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." It's interesting that Isaiah's reaction to seeing this produces this immediate response. It's interesting that Isaiah does not say, "And I was filled with awe, and I saw this, and it just made me stand there for a couple of hours, taking it all in." No, Isaiah's first reaction is to confess his own uncleanness, that he sees this vision of God in his holiness, that God, as he exists in his absolute purity. And the first conclusion Isaiah comes to is that I am no way fit to be in the presence of this God, that his holiness is so far greater than anything that I could ever be, that all I can say in response is that I am not like that, that I am a man who is unclean in my lips and everywhere else. And he lives among a people who are likewise that way, that he is one of the defiled ones, and he therefore stands in danger as he is brought near to see this vision of God. And so he says, "Woe is me, I am ruined." Isaiah immediately comes to the conclusion that his existence is in jeopardy. Then we are told that one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs, and he touched my mouth with it and said, "This has touched your lips. You are now clean. Your iniquity is taken away. Your sin is forgiven." And so, in order for Isaiah to stay there, he must be cleansed. And what's interesting is that he is cleansed with fire. He is cleansed with a burning coal from the altar. So we have this picture of God above the temple. There is a heavenly altar with fire, and it is from that fire that Isaiah is cleansed. And here we begin to perhaps get a sense of what this vision is finally all about. That God and his people must be in fellowship, and that a holy God cannot be in fellowship with an unholy and unclean and corrupted, sinful people. That these people must be cleansed, that they must be a holy people if they're going to have a relationship with God, if they're going to speak for God. You remember the picture in Isaiah chapter 2, that in the latter days the mountain of the house of the Lord would be exalted, and the nations would stream to it, and all of the world would want to come and bask in the light of God. Well, Israel must become that way too, and in order for them to become that people, the people that can be the light to the Gentiles, they've got to stop being unholy, and they've got to become the holy people of God. And so what happened to Isaiah is in effect what must happen to the nation, that they must be cleansed. They must listen and take in God's word in order to survive. They are going to also be cleansed with fire, just like Isaiah had to be cleansed with fire. Now, if we're reading up to this point in the story, we might say, well, okay, this will be a good thing, because Isaiah stands before God. He is taken back by his own sinfulness. God cleanses him and fixes him, and that will happen to the nation. But it's not going to be such a simple or pleasant idea. because the nation is not going to be like Isaiah in its receptivity to God. God says to them very plainly in the text here that I want to send somebody to speak my word to my people. Who will I send? And Isaiah said, send me. And God says, well, here's what you're going to tell these people. Keep on listening, but don't perceive. Keep on looking, but don't understand. Isaiah, I want you to render the hearts of this people insensitive, make their ears dull and their eyes dim, because otherwise they would see with their eyes and hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, they would turn around and be healed. This is a text, and there are some other texts like it in the Bible, that kind of cause us some pause, especially the language like we find here in verse 10. Make them insensitive, make their ears dull. We remember saw a similar thing in the Gospel of John as Jesus was tapping into this picture from Isaiah. Does God make it so that people can't hear him? Does God do something to some people because maybe he doesn't like them or because they're just gross sinners so that even if they wanted to, they couldn't hear God's word? No, that's not the picture in the Bible as well. What God is saying to Isaiah here is that I want you to preach to these people, but I want you to know that they're not going to listen. They're going to refuse to hear. They're going to refuse to see my holiness in contrast to what you have seen, Isaiah. And the picture is that these people have become so corrupt, so wicked, that the more Isaiah preaches to them, the more closed their ears and their eyes and their hearts will become. Now, again, this is not something that God is doing to them directly, as if these people have no choice in it. It is what wicked people do with the Word of God. You may have even had some experience like this yourself in trying to discuss the Bible or something like that with a person who doesn't believe in God or doesn't want to hear about God. And the more you talk about it, the more stubborn they become because their hearts and their minds are made up that they just don't want to hear it. Well, God is saying to Isaiah, that's the way my people have become. They don't want to hear it, Isaiah. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to try. I want you to preach my word to them, Isaiah. But I want you to understand that these people are wicked, and the more you preach to them, the more stubborn they are going to become. And so it makes me kind of wonder if this wasn't kind of a revelation for Isaiah. I mentioned back in one of the introductory lessons that I kind of get the impression sometimes that the people of Isaiah's day probably thought that nothing's wrong. How could God be angry with us? We've been living in the times of King Uzziah. Everything seems to be going well. Nobody thought anything was seriously wrong, and Isaiah comes along and delivers this scathing rebuke to the people. And my opinion is that maybe a lot of people thought, Isaiah, you're wrong. That you are an extremist, that's not how things are. And I kind of wonder here in Isaiah 6 if God is maybe opening Isaiah's eyes a little bit to say, maybe you don't realize how wicked these people really are, Isaiah, but I'm going to tell you that you're going to preach to them and they're never going to listen to you. That's a pretty interesting kind of way to start a ministry, isn't it? This is not God saying, well, you're going to have 50% success. Every other person is going to listen. Or you're going to have X number of people at the end of all your preaching to show that they have listened. No. God says, basically, generically speaking, don't expect anybody to listen. And how long are they going to be this way? Verse 11, I said, Lord, how long? Certainly after some point, they're going to break down and listen. And God said, no, they're never going to do it. It will go until cities are devastated and without inhabitant, houses are without people, and the land is utterly destitute. It will go until the Lord has removed men far away into exile, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. They're going to maintain their stubborn stance until I have to just wipe them out, is the message. So it's not going to be a cheerful thing that Isaiah does here. This is not going to be an enjoyable experience for the prophet, and God wants him to know that right up front. However, there is a glimmer of hope. The New American Standard Bible that I normally use in preaching and teaching says, yet there will be a 10th portion in it. Most of the English translations do not translate this verse that way. Here's the English Standard Version, which is more typical of the English translations. It says, and though a 10th remain in it. Or, even though, or although a 10th. Some translations say something like, if a 10th were to remain in it. And so the picture is that God's going to destroy the place. And if by chance there were a 10th of it that didn't get completely destroyed, God says, I'll burn it again, like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains when it is felled. And so the ideas of a forest that has been cut down and burned, and there might be a piece of a tree sticking up here or there, and God says, I'm going to burn it again. And yet, right at the very end, we hear this message of hope, that the holy seed is in its stump. That even though it has been cut down and burned, there is a seed of life that remains in that stump. We've heard this before in chapter 1 and verse 9, that had the Lord God not left to us a remnant, we would be like Sodom and Gomorrah. That Israel would be completely wiped out if God had not determined that he would spare the faithful. And remember that picture in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 is that the faithful come to be the people of God in the end. And so here the emphasis is on the elimination of the wicked. That God is pretty much going to wipe out his people, punish them, send them into exile. But there will be a small group, like a seed, as it were, of faithful who will come to inherit all the good things that God has promised. I hope this quick view of Isaiah chapter 6 has been helpful, and keep it in mind now as we go into chapter 7, because this image of God and of Isaiah's ministry needs to kind of stay in the background of our minds as we read the rest of the book.